Hello and welcome to Author a la carte for September 5th. Today, our illustrious authors are Ursula Robbins, Susan Agatha Davis, and Fiona Forsyth in First Life. Susan Agatha Davis writes gritty adult crime novels of the revenge vigilante nature. She's a retired criminal attorney. She spent 6 years as a journalist and six as a small town newspaper editor. She has a BA in English and did her graduate work. She's also a Vietnam era veteran. Welcome, Ursula.
Hi.
Hi. And now a reading from Ursula Robbins.
Okay. I'm reading from my first book, which is called When Roses Weep, and I'm beginning in chapter 5 because chapter 5 introduces Rick. And Rick was not the main character in the first book, but he becomes the main character in all my other books because I just fell in love with Rick. So I'll go from there. He's working for an attorney, Anthony De La Rosa. De La Rosa's one and only investigator, Rick Brandt, pushed his way through the heavy metal and glass door and marched into the airy main lobby of the newly remodeled Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The steel heels of his black boots clicked on the neatly tiled floor. People automatically moved aside to let him through, glancing at him quickly and then away as if afraid to be caught staring. Brandt's tanned and tattooed muscles, combined with his black clothes, slick alligator boots, military crew cut, hard features, and arrogant attitude, cut a swath through the small group in front of him like Moses splitting the Red Sea. All he lacked was the staff and the beard. A semi-reformed gambler and former bounty hunter from Philadelphia, Brandt handled his job with fierce loyalty and deadly seriousness mapped across his craggy face. He approached the desk, his jaw clamped around an unlit cigarette. His piercing steel gray eyes made the clerk tense. Elliot, he barked. He's tied up, Mr. Brandt. The young woman shuffled some papers and looked about for someone to rescue her. Her eyes caught those of a security guard who sat up in his chair and carefully watched the interchange. She struggled to avoid looking at the scar that ran from the top corner of Brandt's forehead into his graying, dirty blonde hair. Would you care to wait? Brandt fingered the folded paper he had in his hand as he eyed her. No, I got a subpoena. I'll see if I can get a page. I'll see if I can page him for you. She reached for the phone. Brandt didn't wait for her. Turning, he headed towards the labs and strolled through the metal detector without slowing down. The alarm went off. Rick was stopped by a door, steel, locked, impenetrable by even his defiant will. He looked back at the woman and growled as he waited for her to buzz him through. The security guard jumped to his feet and approached, hand on his holstered weapon and one eye on the receptionist as she put down the phone. Brandt, his hands at his sides like some mythical gunslinger from the Old West, faced the guard. It's okay, the clerk called out across the room. The director cleared him. Make sure he's not carrying a weapon, then he can go in. Relieved, she settled the phone back into its cradle. The guard nodded as his face hardened. Hands up, he ordered. Brandt obliged with a murderous look. Fucking night shift. Can't even think for themselves. He knew better than to carry a weapon into the place, even with a license. The guard ignored the comment with a practiced look of indifference. A pat down and a hand scan later, the guard tapped a code into a security panel and the door clicked open. As if by scent, Brent tracked Elliot through the halls and into one of the labs. The clerk ran after him with a visitor's badge in her hand. Wait, you need this, she yelled. Deputy Director Roger Elliott, still looking fresh from court in his navy suit, starched white shirt, and burgundy bow tie, pulled himself away from a microscope, rose to his full 5'6" height in elevated shoes, and brushed back the edge of his handlebar mustache. Brandt, you're not supposed to be back here, he snarled in a surprisingly low voice. He was cleared, the clerk tried to explain. The director said, it's been 6 months, Elliot. You still reek from that cheap cologne. Grant talked around the unlit cigar clenched in his teeth and took an exaggerated sniff. If that is cologne, it smells more like you've been sleeping in the morgue. What's the matter? Your old lady throw you out again? Elliot turned red. I can still smell white trash when it's standing in front of me. What do you want? His eyes were level with the barbed wire tattoo that encircled Brant's neck. Brant took the faded paper and stuffed it in Elliot's jacket pocket. Consider yourself served. He turned and marched out of the door, brushed past the stunned clerk, and left Elliot swearing behind him. Where the hell's security? Elliot screamed. I want a guard here now. His neck and face glowed redder with his rising blood pressure. But the director said, neophyte. Elliot waved his hands in the air and shouted as he backed the terrified woman out the door. But she said, her, not you, woman. Hell, both of you, goddamn females. The clerk went from fear to rage. She spun on her heel and escaped back to her desk. Grant smacked his lips around the cigarette and smiled as he walked away. The argument faded behind him. Neophyte, he muttered to himself. Good word. Got to remember that one. When Brant reached the parking lot, the rain plastered his black shirt, his muscles like an oil slick. Climbing into his rusted white Jeep, he noticed a familiar sedan with its lights off at the far side of the lot. A slender figure ducked behind the steering wheel. Smiling, Brant drove out of the lot and down the road. I've got Tony Rose. It's Tony De La Rosa. Figures this is the book I haven't corrected. Tony De La Rosa was exhausted. She scrunched down in the shadows of her car, her black denim jacket collar turned up against the damp air. She peered through the rain-sheathed windshield and across the glistening parking lot. From time to time, her eyes went to the neon green readout of the dashboard clock. Then she looked up again, waiting and watching, her fingers playing with the silver cross strung on the chain around her neck. She was too fixated on the lit entryway of the building to notice the Jeep pull up behind her. When Rick Brant rapped his knuckles on the passenger side window, Tony jumped. She hit the unlock button and let him in. What are you doing here? I thought you were headed back to the office. Her attention immediately returned to the doorway of the crime lab. Brant plopped his damp body into the seat next to her and handed her a Philadelphia Eagles travel mug. Just thought you could use some fresh coffee. He chewed on the dead cigarette and eyed her suspiciously. What's your excuse? That thing stinks. Get rid of it, Tony ordered, indicating the cigarette. Looking disgusted, Brant rolled down the window and tossed the offending butt into the rain. Tony huddled down further, wrapped her pale hands around the warm mug, took a sip of brew, and screwed up her nose. There's nothing in it. Tom said you're watching your carbs. Rick closed his eyes and rested his head against the back seat. Asshole. Pointed to the glove compartment. Catch, she ordered. Huh? He opened his eyes. Catch. Grant smirked, flicked open the compartment, and took out a small metal flask with something illegible engraved on the side. He unscrewed the top. Hold her steady, he ordered Tony, who had removed the cap from her coffee mug. Grant poured in a jigger of bourbon, took a swig himself, screwed the top back on the flask, and returned. I take it you served him. She took a drink of coffee and made a satisfied sigh. The liquid cleansed her as it burned down her throat. Yup. Grant's gaze went from the building back to the girl as he studied her. Keep your mind on business, she said without looking at him. Tony was staring straight ahead as she handed the mug back to Brant. Roger Elliott, wearing a tan trench coat and carrying a large black umbrella. I'm just going to switch glasses a second. These are not quite as good enough. Okay, Roger Elliott, wearing a tan trench coat and carrying a large black umbrella and his briefcase, paused briefly in the doorway of the building. His eyes scanned the parking lot quickly before he spotted Brant's Jeep. Recognizing it, he fumbled the keys and dropped them in a puddle. Elliott bent over, fished the keys out of the dirty water, shook them out, and made a run for his red Mustang. It looks kind of rattled. How did he take it? Tony asked. She started the engine but kept the headlights off until Elliott's car was ready to enter traffic. Brant just shrugged. That's what I love most about you, Rick. Tony flashed a warm smile. You're such a stimulating conversationalist. Oh, you love me? He bantered back. I wondered when you'd finally warm up to that.
Oh,
He smiled. Well, at least I know when to keep my mouth shut. You could almost hear her hiss. You are so full of shit. Only pulled forward and merged into traffic a couple of car lengths behind Elliot. Brent chuckled. I'm not the one who talked myself into a suspension. That was a goddamn year ago. Still, he enjoyed tormenting her. I take it back. You do talk too much. Now shut up and let me work. Her windshield wipers emphasized her words. Brent drank some of Tony's coffee and screwed up his face. Burned, he growled as he rolled down the window and tossed the drink into the street. Hey, that's good bourbon, Tony yelled. I've had better. He threw the plastic mug over his shoulder to the floor in the back seat. You ruined it with the coffee. She growled. I did not talk myself into suspension. I tried to talk myself out of it. I can't help it if the department is run by mindless twits. Brett shrugged off the remark. Piss off the sheriff again, you'll be walking the Mexican border looking for illegals. Tony knew that could never happen, of course, but she got the point. And here I thought you didn't love me. Somebody's got to watch your sexy ass, Rick told her. Tony groaned. You and Tom, always watching my ass. Nen. With familiar ease, Brant slid a hand up her thigh. She felt it quiver under his touch. It's only 'cause we care, darling, he muttered. She slapped his hand away. Where the hell is he going? Tony asked as Elliot's car bypassed the usual spots, headed southwest. Henderson? Brant suggested. Tony groaned. It's going to be a long night. Tony drove a few cars back from Elliot. She kept in different lanes when possible, occasionally slowing down as if trying to read passing house numbers in the dim light of street lights. If Elliot noticed her, he didn't show it. He drove deliberately, slightly over the limit when he could, his eyes straight ahead. As they reached the suburbs with neat rows of copycat adobe houses, the traffic thinned out. Pull back, Rick instructed. I know what I'm doing. The rain stopped and Tony rolled down her window. The night air was cool on her red cheeks. Rick didn't respond. He watched as Elliot turned left at a corner and down a narrow street lined with sparse palm trees and rock garden front yards. Tony drove straight through the same intersection and pulled into a parking area adjacent to the neighborhood tennis courts. The green surface of the court was nearly black in the night, except where the street lamps bathed the edges. She slowly turned the car around. What you gonna do? Rick asked. She headed back down the street and turned right, following Elliot's path, while reaching into the back seat and picking up a map. Here, unfold this all the way and read it and try to look lost. I am lost. Rick hadn't been paying attention to the streets as they were following Elliot. He slipped another unlit cigarette into his mouth before he pressed his face deep into the map to hide himself and Tony. A few minutes later, he saw Elliot's car parked in the driveway of one of the homes. The lab director stepped out into the night, glanced at the passing vehicle with little interest, and headed towards the house. The street was eerily silent. Distracted. Got something else on his mind, Rick noted. Or someone, Tony added. At that moment, a beautiful blonde woman walked out of the home and onto the front stoop. Her hair was swept up in a ponytail. Her trim body was barely covered in retro capri pants and a tube top. Tony watched them through her rearview mirror as she turned the car down another side street and put the couple behind her. Elliot and the woman embraced with a long, deep kiss. Tony groaned. Watch it, Rick yelled. Tony hit the brake and slid 2 feet past a stop sign on the oily pavement. Fortunately, no vehicles were coming. She gripped the steering wheel tightly with both hands as her heart pounded in her ears. Don't do that, she yelled. Next time, I drive. Brant loosened his grip on the dashboard. He slapped the map out of his face and screwed his body around to look out the back window. Elliot and the blonde were framed in the light of the doorway. They were just turning to enter the house. Elliot's arm wrapped intimately around the woman's hips. Funny, he doesn't look worried about being served, Brant muttered. I need a drink. Tony drove across the intersection and executed a 3-point turn, put off the car's headlights, and parked with the house in front of her window. She pointed to the glove compartment with a silent order to fetch, while she kept her eyes on Elliot. From somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Don't think booze will help, Brant reluctantly offered, refusing to get out the flask. Just pass me the damn thing, Tony insisted. Christ, I'm not even tipsy yet. Hey, baby, you know I like you. Hell, I'd sit down and put away a fifth with you. But right now you're drinking, driving, carrying a gun, and pissed. I think more booze is a bad idea. You don't get to think, period. She was instantly sorry for yelling at him. I didn't mean that. Yeah, I know. It's that time of the year. Brent ignored her anger. He glanced in the direction of the barking dog and frowned. The memory of Sarah's tortured body. This refers back to the death of Alessandra de la Rosa's wife 5 years ago. The memory of Sarah's tortured body was in and out of Tony's mind faster than a bolt of lightning. We're not talking about that, remember? Her cell phone went off and she jumped. Damn, she glanced at the caller ID and saw Tom Sadler's name. Now what? She put the phone to her ear. Where the hell have you been? Tom yelled before she could say a word. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm off duty. Tony skipped her into the hello part as well. She ran her fingers through her damp hair. We're on call, Tom reminded her. He stood in the hospital corridor, his jacket soaked from rain, phone pressed to his ear. He needed sleep, a lot of sleep. Tonight? No way. Chuck said he'd cover for me. I told you at lunch. I had to have tonight off. Tony reached into the back seat, grabbed Alex's camera, and handed it to Rick as she pointed to the house. The second before the front door closed, Rick focused and took his shot. That was then. This is now, Tom argued. Rick balanced the camera on the dashboard to keep it steady for the slow exposure and clicked a few more photos for good measure. Tom grew increasingly irritated with Tony. Chuck's out of commission. I need you at the Desert Palm Hospital immediately. Why there? Of all the hospitals? What do you mean out of commission? Home with the flu, Tom explained. The blue flu, I bet, Tony snickered. No, the one that's going around. So shut up and get your ass here now. My fucking ass? Why is everybody after my fucking ass? She heard someone yell over the phone. Move in the vicinity of Tom. What have you got? Tony groaned inwardly. She stared at the house as if committing every aspect of its mundane architecture to memory. Hit and run on Paradise. We got 3 dead, a 4th critical, and 3 we can interview if you hurry, Tom said. Paradise? Her heart skipped as she clenched the phone. Alex. Rick looked up at her. No, he wasn't there. This is work. Get over here. Tony closed her eyes a moment and breathed a long sigh of relief. I should note that Tony is Alex's sister. How many vehicles? She glanced at Rick and shook her head as if telling him everything was all right. He nodded and returned his attention to the house. 2. The dead were pedestrians, Tom explained. Tony swore. All right, I'll be right there. Hurry, Tom yelled. Rick took another photo. I said I'll be right there. Keep your goddamn pants on. He shut off the phone and turned to Brandt. Gotta go. Yep, got that, he nodded. Work, 401A, fatality. Tom calls and I go running. She dropped the phone into her jacket pocket. I need to change that. You on swing? Rick asked. Back up. Tom's a lucky bastard. Brandt grinned. Examined the camera. If you want, I'll come back out and keep an eye on things. Don't bother. By the time you get back, you'll be long gone. Brandt reached into the depths of his jacket pocket, pulled out several mints, and handed them to her. She took them without comment. As Tony prepared to pull back into the street, Elliot walked out of the house and back to his car, his arm around the blonde. He opened the passenger side door and helped her in before he got into the driver's seat. That was fast. Tony reached for the camera, but Rick held on to it. Who is she? Brent asked with a tone of appreciation. He focused the zoom lens and clicked off a round of shots. The shapely body disappeared into the car. Not sure, but she looks familiar. Tony couldn't put a name on the face. Well, if he's spending the night with that, it won't do any good to watch him anyway. Rick aimed and took more shots at the couple as the car backed out of the driveway and turned to leave. Got him. Tony drove back to Vegas, left Brandt at the crime lab to get his Jeep, and headed for the hospital. When she arrived, she found Tom angrily pacing the hall floor, a lone figure in a black LVPD windbreaker and a sea of white and pastel hospital uniforms. Where have you been? He asked the second he saw her. Henderson, working a case. She sucked on the mints. You smell like a bar, he noted. I was off duty, remember? She crossed her arms defiantly. Off duty? On a case? Which is it? What case? Tom's eyebrows shot up. You mean one of Alex's cases? When are you going to get it into your thick skull, detective, that you work for the city of Las Vegas? Not your brother. Several of the hospital staff turned and hushed him at the same time. Tony propped her fists on her hips and glowered at him. For your information, Bozo, I was working the Callis case. Not drunk, you weren't. Besides, that's already went to the DA. We're done with it, Tom argued with his lower voice. He rubbed his tired eyes as a headache loomed. Alex said, that's my point, Tony. He waved a finger back and forth between them. The Las Vegas Police Department arrested the killer, charged him, and built our case against him. It's our job to get him convicted, not get him off. Get that? He stepped into her space and tried not to yell. You don't work for Alex, you work for the city. How many times do I have to remind you of that? But don't make me repeat myself, Detective. Tom stiffened with rage. You should listen to your partner. Sheriff George Randall's deep voice punctuated the argument. His large frame was stuffed into a rain-soaked business suit. He looked irate. He jerked a handkerchief from his pocket and sneezed. No one knew how long the sheriff had been standing there, or how much he'd heard. Randall handed the officers the preliminary reports on the accident. This is what we got so far, he told them as he wiped his nose. Finish the interviews, then report back to the office. And no detours. The last remark was made for Tony's benefit. Randall started to walk away when his phone rang. He stopped to answer the call, his back to them. One of these days you're going to get us both fired, Tom whispered. Randall sneezed. You tell that woman to be in my office in 10 minutes, he yelled into the phone. He wiped his runny nose again. And the next time that little vulture shows up, you call me. Got that? Clicked off the phone and hurried out the door. Tony, red with embarrassment, groaned and glanced down at the accident report, drafted by one Patrolman Carol McEnroe. Suddenly, she put a face to a name and knew who the woman was at the house in Henderson. Tony wondered how McEnroe had managed to seduce Alex, report the accident, and make it home in such short time. That little slut, Tony hissed. Tom looked at her, bewildered. Something you care to share, he asked. Tony ignored him and marched toward the nurses. And that's the end of that chapter. Did I make 15 minutes or did I run over?
You ran over, but that's all right.
Okay. I want to make sure it ended at the scene.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Sorry. I love your skill with dialogue. It's one of the things I look up to you about.
Oh, thanks. Okay, now what?
I am getting organized. So, okay, first of all, I just want to take a break. I forgot a lot in my intro. Everyone, first I'd like to thank Harry Guzman for creating this concept of author a la carte. If anyone is having problems hearing the interview, please let me know. And to my left, you can see copies of our guest authors' books. And if you click on them, right click, they will open your browser and take you to where you can buy a copy for yourself or put it on your wish list. And I'd also like to point out the tip jar. The proceeds go to today's guest authors. So,
I'd like to add that. May I add something?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I should add a couple of things. The first is that's the first of 6 books so far. 5 are on
yes, you're getting ahead of
Amazon.com,
my interview.
And also that's the 2013 edition. So look for a later edition because that one's got all the mistakes in it.
Oh dear. Okay, well we will in a future copy of the book we will fix that link.
Okay.
All right. So Ursula, tell us where you're from and when you first knew you wanted to write.
I'm from northern Vermont. I grew up on a very small dairy farm. My dad was a farmer. My mom was a secretary. I have a younger brother who's an electrical engineer. And I don't know when I wanted to write. I only knew I always created stories. I started making up stories before I was in school. And by the time I was in 3rd or 4th grade, my cousin and I lived in Cleveland, and we would spend the summers together. And we would do round robin storytelling. And then as we got older, we were around 12 or so. Because we lived so far apart, we would write each other long, long letters. And the letters would be entirely fictitious.
Mhm.
I would write a letter like, "Dear Kathy, I landed in Paris today, and I met so and so. I did such and such," and she would write me back. And it was all completely made up. So technically, that was my first creative writing. And then I wrote my first book when I was 14. I was living in a dormitory in a parochial high school on the Canadian border, and my dorm mates, who were largely from New York City, were reading as I was writing, and they would critique my reading and writing, and they would say, "Oh no, he can't do that," or you can't write that. That's because they get all worked up and into the characters. But I had decided I wanted to major in English and write books. That was my goal. When I told my mother that, she had a fit, even though she had inspired me to write and had supported my reading, bought me tons of books, really was great about that whole thing. But she said, "No, you can't be a writer. You have to make a real living." So we had a big fight about that, and I burned that book, my first book. And I didn't start writing another book until I was 50. And in the meantime, I wrote poetry and a few short stories, editorials, worked at the newspaper, worked in law. So I guess I'm getting carried away. Sorry.
That's quite all right. So, rather controversial question for some authors, but how old are you, and how has the era you grew up in shaped you as a writer?
Okay. Well, I was born when Truman was president. I like saying that because it always gets strange looks on people's faces.
Yes.
I'm 67. I'm a grandmother, a mother of three, grandmother of three boys. And I think having to, oh, see, you just printed that whole thing up there for me to read, right? I grew
That's
up in time, yeah.
captioning for the audience.
Okay. Yeah, when I was growing up, we didn't have much television. In fact, we had one TV with two channels that were both in black and white, and I think both of them ran Gunsmoke. Um, we still had a crank phone, but that tells you where it was. I was in college before the first, refrigerator-sized computers came out. So everything was about books, and I think that was a big thing. I don't think young people today read anywhere near as much as we did because they have alternatives. And so I read Mark Twain, I read Shakespeare, I read Hemingway, I read Steinbeck, I read Virginia Woolf, I read I don't know if you've got a name to a. I read them. I was entranced with literature. I lived on a farm. I was away from everybody. I had a very active imagination, and I just ate books for breakfast, lunch, and supper. And when I got to high school, my best courses were English and history. And I founded the high school literary magazine and editor of it, and I wrote for it. Um, but I think that was the big thing. I think growing up in a time where books were the center of the world because you didn't have alternatives, you didn't have a lot of television, that sort of thing. I probably did not include everything I said before, but that's where that's where I'm at.
And how many books have you written?
Well, I tend to tell people that I've written five and I have the sixth one in the works. But when I look back over my history, I've actually written seven because I wrote the first one when I was 14. And then I ended up tossing it away. It was 450 pages. It was a romance novel about a Cold War Russian spy who falls in love with a Swiss diplomat and how they escape the United States and the trials they go through. And it was kind of a cool story. Someday I may go back and rewrite it again. And then I wrote the second one, which was a fanfic book entitled Mistress of the Sea. And I wrote it for a Star Trek online fan fiction group. And I posted it there, and we were going to Los Angeles for a big fundraiser for the Down Syndrome Association called the Galaxy Ball. And this was the year of 9/11. And so 2001. So I had posted, when I got to Los Angeles, I found out that one of my online mates had actually turned it into a small book and had printed it out and handed it to everybody at the convention. So technically, that was my second book. I had a copy once. I have no idea what happened to it. I didn't write a book again until 2013 when I began working on When Roses Weep. And I always say that took me about 10 years, but it was a case of starting and stopping and starting and stopping for a long time. And then when I finally sat down and did it, I did it in about a year. And ever since then, I've done every book has been about 9 months to a year. I'm behind. I'm behind about 6 months, because I actually took a real life 8 hour a day job, and that sort of slowed down my writing for a bit.
And what first inspired the story of When Roses Weep?
The TV show CSI. I fell in love with that show. I'm a serious William Peterson fan, and I started writing a fan fiction based on that show, and it turned into a really, really good, really, really long online book. And I liked it so much, I decided that I was going to translate it into my own version of a detective story. So I started with the main plot that I devised in that, and I gave it new, fresh characters. But what happened is when the characters started coming alive in my head, of course, they wrote the plot differently, and I ended up with a completely different plot. But it was a fun experience. Yeah.
And that's what happens when you forget to turn the microphone on. Alrighty then.
Okay.
Yes, I understand exactly what you mean, and I'll come back to that again later. You mentioned a love of mythology in our personal conversation, and
Oh yeah.
how would you say that has impacted this book?
Mythology was my well, mythology and fairy tales aren't that far apart.
Yes.
And my first fairy tale book was one of those with. Do you know who Alphonse Mucha is, the artist?
I don't,
He
but I
has a
will be
very
looking him up.
okay. He has a very specific style, and my books were done in that style, and I just loved the artwork, and I fell in love with the stories. And I was in elementary school, I don't know, third or fourth grade, when I discovered Native American mythology. And my dad was Native American, my mom was Polish Gypsy, so it makes for an interesting mix. And I really delved into Native American mythology, and I started reading it voraciously. And by the time I got to seventh grade, sixth or seventh grade, I discovered Greek mythology. By the time I was in eighth grade, I think I had read just about everything there was. Um, but that triggered me into reading classical literature. I read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and um, I can't even begin to tell you everything I've read. I mean, there's just thousands of books. But I learned about symbolism, and I learned about archetypes, and I learned about uh, concepts of dualism and postmodernism and critical literary theory and all that kind of stuff. And I just, I ate it up. It was like candy. So when I started writing, I was unconsciously mapping my stories out according to things I had learned. My archetypes, the concept of a reluctant hero who is drawn into an adventure and pulls along a posse and has to go through a death-like spiritual or physical experience, and then has to come back with the trophy or whatever it is. And I wasn't even thinking about when I wrote it, and it wasn't until I got past my third book that I thought to myself, what is it I'm doing here? And so I looked up a book I had read in college, like 20 or 30 years. Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I could see how I had been sort of unconsciously or semi-consciously following that map. And that really helped me a lot to understand my writing and to develop my characters better.
Yes, I was absolutely. As you were speaking, I was starting to think of the hero's journey and the hero with a thousand faces.
Right.
So, a bonus question. Um, You mentioned that you're 67, and
Yes.
right now we're currently in the sort of the fan fiction realms. There still remains this controversy about fan fiction, about whether it's real art and whether it's legitimate. And as someone who I want to say, as someone who is an extremely experienced person, experienced writer, what could you teach younger fan fiction writers? What do you want to do? You have anything you want to say to them about when people kind of poo poo their writing as just fan fiction? What would you teach them or tell them?
Um, well, first place, I want to say that fan fiction is great training ground for writers, for published authors. It's fantastic. You are writing to an active group who reads your stuff and critiques it and asks you questions about it every single day.
Mhm.
I wrote fan fiction for 4 or 5 years in different genres, and it was always interesting to get the feedback, and it spurred me on to be better. They'd say, well, you wrote this and I don't understand this, and I go back and rework it. I think it is art. I think anytime you apply your imagination, creative effort to do something, it's art. Whether or not it's commercial art, whether or not it's selling art, um, is a whole nother story. And it may even be considered amateur art. But how many? I mean, Grandma Moses was an amateur artist until somebody discovered who she was. Uh, but it's a great training ground, and I would encourage people to keep using it that way and learn from it and study writing and combine it with what they're doing.
Wonderful. I'm glad I asked. So, this book is the first in a series.
Right.
Tell us where you're taking us next in your books.
Okay. Yeah. This is such a fun series. I didn't realize it was going to be this much fun. When I wrote the first book, I thought that was going to be it. This book starts out with two main characters: Alex De La Rosa, who is an attorney, and Fran Simone, who is also an attorney and works for him. And they have this law practice in Las Vegas. And he's originally from Italy, but he's been in the States since he was a child. But he has just a touch of an Italian accent, and he's kind of suave and debonair and sexy. And I originally thought he was going to be the star of any series I might write. But what happened was I really got to the point where I didn't like him. He was just too shallow, and I couldn't build enough of a backstory around him. So having been a woman attorney, I switched the story around, and I made Fran the center of the story. And that worked better. She was a great character. She's strong. She's belligerent. She's an alcoholic. She has a history. And in chapter 5, I introduce Rick, their investigator, as the third wheel, if you will, to the storyline. But I really, really liked Rick. And at the end of book 1, Rick rides off into the sunset, so to speak. He goes to Mexico. Basically, he's fleeing the law. It's kind of a complicated story, but I'll just leave it at that. In book 2, I decided I was going to bring Rick. And Rick and Fran basically fall in love. And it's a passionate, wild, crazy, dangerous kind of love. He is this gun-toting former Marine with a background as a gangbanger, who has killed more people than he can count, and has a quick temper, but manages to be the cool, tough guy. And Fran is a Scotchaholic, and she's divorced from a very controlling, dangerous ex-husband. And she has this snotty 14-year-old kid. Well, she starts out as 12, becomes 14 by book 6, who argues with her all the time, gives her a hard time, occasionally gets into trouble, and decides she hates Rick because he's so dangerous and he's a threat to them. And all she wants in her life is to have normal parents. And Rick and Fran go through these adventures where they're up against the mob, or they're up against a former a serial killer or a former dangerous enemy or whatever the case may be. And they get dragged into these strange situations and they meet these colorful characters. I have a friend's best friend, Candy, is the former director of the crime lab. She's the one that everybody was yelling at about letting Rick into the thing. And she's a former dominatrix also, which gets her fired. And there's just these wild, wild characters. Charlie Cook runs a gun shop, and he's a mountain man who's a sniper. And Sam is their emergency room doctor, and his parents were from India, so he has the complexion and coloring of somebody from India, but he's from Jersey, and he's a tough character. Just tons and tons of colorful people that I've really enjoyed creating. And they go through horrendous experiences. Like people get kidnapped and shot and killed,
Of course.
drowned, and God knows what.
As they say, kill your darlings.
Yeah, I haven't killed off any of my main characters yet. I think about it once in a while, but every time I think about Rick or Fran dying and what it would do to the other character, I start bawling, and I decide, no, I can't write that now.
How has the Second Life community helped you to become a better writer?
I joined Second Life about 15 years ago, and at the time I was going through a very bad time in real life, and I needed an escape outlet. And I was talking to an old boyfriend of mine who was actually one of the first engineers to work on voice. And he said, "Oh, you've got to try this out. You've got to come to Second Life and try this out." So I got immersed in role playing for the first 5 or 6 years, like so many people. I did gore. I also did medieval role playing, some sci-fi stuff, just all kinds of things. I experimented. I had a lot of fun. Sometimes it was a little aggravating, but in general, I had a lot of fun. But doing role playing was just challenged me to be descriptive in my vocalization. When I was typing something, when I was saying something, I had to put more out there. I couldn't assume that people knew things. And so I think that kind of stretched my ability to write. It pushed me further in that direction.
Well, I want to give a gigantic thank you to our author, Ursula Robbins, Susan Agatha Davis. And again, if you would like to click on her novel on the table, it can take you to a link to her book. Thank you.
I'm so happy you get my name right. So many people don't.
Susan Agatha Davis.
No, I'm talking about Ursula.
Ursula Robbins on Second Life.
Yeah, so many. I get Erica, I get Ursula, I get all kinds of stuff.
Well,
yeah, Finn. Yeah, Finn loves Rick. Rick is so cool. He is like, he is your favorite bad guy, and he's the good guy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
And next up we have Finn Bookmite.
Ooh, I got to sit around for this. Okay, find a chair. Come on, sit.
Hello, Nicole.
Hello, Finn. And pausing for station identification while everyone gets settled, we are on Milkwood Writers Colony. Trying to remember if there's anything I've forgotten at this point.
Waving back, Ursula. And yeah, that was where I learned how to pronounce your name.
Oh, actually, all right. End of part one.